Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy, and looking forward to today's conversation with CBS News reporter John Vigliotti. But first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow and subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Let me tell you a little bit about Jonathan Vigliotti. He is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow Award-winning CBS News national correspondent whose work has appeared on numerous platforms including CBS Sunday Morning, Face the Nation, 48 Hours, and more. His reporting has taken him to more than 40 countries and territories across 6 continents. His debut book is Before It's Gone, Stories from the Front Lines of Climate Change in Small-Town America, and it's on sale April 2nd. Jonathan, welcome into the back room.
Thank you for having me.
So you have a book that just came out called Before It's Gone, Stories from the Front Lines of Climate Change in Small-Town America. It's on sale April 2nd, in fact. Tell us about the book and what you hope the biggest takeaway is from it.
Yeah, the book focuses on climate change, the impact that it's having on radicalizing our weather, and the impact those extreme weather events are having on more and more communities across the country. I specifically in the book focus on small-town America. I see small towns as canaries in the coal mine for what larger communities will face as our climate threat continues to increase and as man loses its power with all of its modern tools over a more extreme Mother Nature with all of her radicalized weather. So I try to take a bigger perspective, a bird's eye view of the impact that this weather is having on our communities. And then I go small right onto the front lines where I report. I spend a lot of my time pinballing across the country covering extreme weather events. And my hope is that I can help readers through this book connect the dots as I've been able to do from being on the front lines between climate change, the impact it's having on weather, so that people can understand what climate change and its role is in threatening our communities. And ultimately, there is some fear in the book, of course, because it is scary, the stories that I do cover, but I hope that there is hope provided here for readers, for communities that are still standing, to build more resilient communities moving forward. So the impact of our climate-fueled weather doesn't take more and more American main streets off the map.
Mm-hmm. You know, there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding when it comes to climate change, from the ridiculous statements like, how can there be global warming when it's so cold in the winter? You know, like the fact that there are cold days to some people negates the concern over climate change. How frustrating is that to you when you hear that? Because it really speaks to the need, the dire need to educate people.
It does. And I think it also speaks to just how abstract climate change and the climate science has been for many. I think it's overwhelming to understand the science sometimes for many people. And I think the solutions can oftentimes be daunting as well. Climate change is radicalizing our weather in ways that are unexpected, from increasing the heat in the summer and increasing the cold in the winter. We saw that in Buffalo just a few years ago, where a storm encapsulated cars in ice and many people died in their cars. That is an example of climate change. For me, I think the important tool is information and clear information at that, clearly linking the climate science to what is unfolding. I don't know if you know the professor, the psychologist at Harvard University, Dan Gilbert. He had a TED Talk a few years ago that I watched that partly inspired this book. And he talks about the key to happiness. And while discussing this, specifically mentions the prefrontal cortex. It's this part of our brain that gives us the power to imagine things before they happen. Unlike any other animal in the kingdom, we have this part of our brain, and it's an adaptation that prevents us from doing foolish things as long as the information is clear. And part of that brain is triggered through storytelling. Stories told to us by friends, family, strangers, and the media. And it's incredibly effective when the messaging is clear. So when I think about climate change and how we could do this clearer, I was thinking about those anti-smoking campaigns that I've seen as a kid growing up on television, as an adult now, those ads that show people in some state of suffering warning others not to pick up a pack of cigarettes. They are actually incredibly effective. As I was doing research for this book, I found that in New York City, The health department there found for every dollar it spent on its anti-smoking campaign, it saved $32 in medical costs. That's because the information was very clear. People saw with their eyes what the threat was. They listened to those stories and they took simple action to protect themselves. With climate change, it can be abstract. It can be hard for people to take similar action. And there is research that shows in the past 40 years, 6 times more people have actually moved into areas, coastal communities threatened by storms and flooding, than into safer nearby inland communities. These are people that I believe aren't choosing to do this intentionally. Many of them have 30-year mortgages, believe that their home will probably last that long. I think the problem is in communicating the climate threat. And from my experience and my perspective on the front lines of these storms, there is a clear connection. And I realize many people don't have that access like I do. So in my book, I hope to connect those dots in a way that triggers that part of the imagination. So people can imagine the worst case scenario, but can also imagine a path forward for themselves, their families, and their communities.
Well, it's so interesting what you're saying because there is so much footage of Katrina and the wildfires and tornadoes. Like, you would think that when people, unless they're not watching the news, but I mean, I can't imagine that you live in such a bubble that you don't see clips, even on TikTok or wherever people do. Some people spend. You would think that they're seeing the consequence of climate change and feeling the heat. I mean, come on, the hottest 10 years in history or what? The last 10 years, right? Like, how do people not know that this is such an existential threat to our climate and the environment?
Well, it's a great point. I won't pretend to know the answer for everybody, but I will say, speaking for myself, covering so many storms. I was on the front lines in 2012, working as a local reporter at WNBC in New York City during Superstorm Sandy. I failed back then while showing all of those images, while live in the middle of the storm and then covering the aftermath. I failed to mention climate change. I don't even think I mentioned climate change once in that reporting. So it is one thing to show those images, but if you're not clearly connecting the dots for viewers, I think it's easy to treat each and every storm as individual and not connected. But these storms are all connected and they're all linked to climate change. And as I have grown up in the industry and as a journalist, I've made more of an effort to cover the climate link to these storms. And I think the failure to link climate change to the storms that we're reporting on is what leads people to not truly understand and appreciate and fear and prepare for these storms, which I've covered. I can't even count how many historic storms. Every storm I cover seems to be a new historic storm. These storms aren't just getting worse coincidentally. It's because of our climate. The more we connect the dots between climate and these storms, I think the more people will start to understand just exactly what it is that they are seeing on television.
Do you think that the real existential threat in the minds of people is so far into the future? Like, yeah, we may all die in a flood, but it ain't going to be in my lifetime, or maybe we're all going to perish in a fire, but it's not going to be while I'm alive. I mean, on the one hand, you could say, okay, that's probably the case, but don't you have children and grandchildren? Aren't you concerned about what they're going to be facing in 30, 40, 50 years? I think you're right. I think they're not connecting the dots to what it eventually is going to lead to. And even if they do, they don't seem to care.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to this failure of imagination and also our failure as journalists. I'll speak from the perspective as a journalist to convey the information that climate scientists are putting out there and to clearly make it digestible for those that don't have a science background. And even if they do, perhaps still fail to truly understand some of the links. I could give you an example. Lahaina, the fire that happened there last year, I was one of the first network teams to arrive in Lahaina. This was a fire that local leaders described as an explosion. They said time and time again in the press conferences that followed, it was like a bomb going off. And they were implying that there was no warning, there was no time to take action. But scientists had actually, nearly 10 years before this fire in 2014, put out a report saying that the warming climate was increasing the threat of wildfire in the community there on the island of Maui and Lahaina specifically. And they even put forward steps that could be taken to prevent disaster, including removing dry invasive grasses that had taken root and turned the area into a tinderbox, restoring the wetlands, which had been depleted because of population growth. And they even suggested building and updating homes with fire-resistant materials, materials that would have been covered and qualified for tax credits and would have reduced insurance rates. And yet, this report, when it was put out, was essentially filed away by local leaders. And they didn't take action because in their minds, 10, 20, 30 years, we've got time to work on this. We can address this later. There are bigger issues, perhaps, in our community we must address. But those warnings, unheeded, became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of the questions is, so what would have happened had they listened to that report, had they taken it seriously, had they put in some of those implementations, those mitigation efforts? In the miles-long path of destruction that we walk through along historic Front Street, we're talking home after home, business after business destroyed. There was one home left still standing, unscathed. It's known as the home with the red roof locally. And those homeowners, while updating their home prior to this storm, had implemented those mitigation efforts that were recommended by scientists. They had created defensible space by cutting down trees and bushes that were too close to the home. They had put a river stone moat, if you will, around the house to prevent flames if they hit the grass, which they did in this case, from reaching the foundation. And they built that red roof on the top using metal. So when flames and ash landed on the home, it didn't go up in flames. There are examples of homes with the red roof in disasters by other names across the country. And these are people that have been more sensitive to the information, perhaps more knowledgeable. They understood the threat that they would face. And even when local leaders, in the case of Lahaina, didn't take action, they were able to do so individually. And I think the message and the lesson learned from this tragedy is that we as individuals, as individual communities, have the power to restore our habitats, our local communities, to a more resilient state. So when extreme weather fueled by climate change, our use of fossil fuels and our emission of greenhouse gases, when those weather events do hit, our strengthened communities and ecosystems are more prepared.
That's incredible. I mean, that is an incredible example that you just gave. I mean, it shows that people can actually, and governments can and should be able to control their own destinies when it comes to these weather disasters. But why don't you see more when it comes to the governments? Is it just lack of funding, lack of concern? Is it just complacency? Why wouldn't more people and more governments, state, local, et cetera, do this sort of thing?
There are federal programs out there, and it involves educating local leaders, educating residents in these communities, empowering them with this information so that they can take action. I think it can be overwhelming to have to cut through a lot of bureaucratic red tape to get access to some of this funding. Lahaina was offered this funding with that plan that was put forward by those scientists. Why that funding wasn't used specifically for these efforts to safeguard and protect the community, that's still unclear. I think there's a lot of focus on climate change, and rightfully so. It is the main threat that we all face as we release more greenhouse gas emissions. But it is abstract and it is overwhelming because it requires the global community to buy into this idea and to work as one to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And even if we did today, the science is very clear that because of a delayed feedback loop, it would still take decades to see the positive impacts of that kind of change by stopping our greenhouse gas emissions. I've likened it to taking an aspirin for a headache. It takes 30 minutes for it to work. It doesn't work immediately. Right. The same is true for planet Earth, but reducing our planet's fever takes much more time. In the meantime, we don't need to be paralyzed by this thought and by the overwhelming sense that we need the global input. Back to what you were saying, what we've been discussing, there is power in the individual and in the individual community. And I don't think that's been stressed enough, at least in my reporting. I'll speak for myself. And I try to really, nowadays, with the stories that I do, I try to really make that link and that connection. And in this book, I really try to hit home that connection, that while some of the information can be paralyzing and overwhelming because of the world stage, there is our local stage. And I focus on small towns, but this is also small cities and large cities. We all have the individual power as communities and as individuals within those communities to take action today that can strengthen each and every community.
So the structure of the book takes readers through 4 major categories of natural disaster: fire, water, air, earth. It also profiles ordinary Americans. There's a Louisiana couple, a California teacher, that are impacted by severe weather. What was the thinking behind these decisions you made for this book?
One sentence that I wrote down in my journal before I even started writing this book was, before every disaster, there is usually a scientist that has been ignored. You may have noticed part of this theme in our discussion. I expand on that to include survivors. Before every disaster, there is a survivor from a previous disaster that has been forgotten. And to quote Brene Brown, I think she said, survivors offer survivor guides. They can guide us through disasters, how people on the flip side of luck who haven't been impacted yet, if they are, God forbid, impacted, how they can recover. But ideally, these survivor guides can also give a rule book to others who haven't been impacted to hopefully take action and prevent the same thing from happening to their communities. I think storytelling through the eyes of people who have lived through these disasters is a powerful tool to connect through empathy with others that think that this could never happen to me. In fact, every survivor that's featured in this book that I've spoken with, and the ones that aren't featured in this book, all believed they were safe. This could never happen to me. But as they learned, it could happen to them. It did happen to them. Many of them are now a modern American pioneer trying to rebuild their community's loss in a safer, more resilient way. And my hope is readers listening to these stories will be inspired by them and empowered by their stories to take action on their own as well.
How is life in general impacted in a disaster-prone area once a disaster occurs and afterwards?
No, it's completely uprooted. You have people who struggle to pick up the pieces of their community, but of their own lives. You have traditions, cultures, livelihoods, a sense of family lost in an instant. You were talking about some of the survivors that were profiled in this book. Kylie and Ellie Werble, a mother and daughter team. They live in Paradise, California, which was impacted by the Camp Fire in 2018, which destroyed 95% of the town. I met them 6 months after the fire as they were working to rebuild. And they never believed something like this could happen to them. And when it did, they immediately started to pick up the pieces. They rented a trailer. They lived on the outskirts of town. It was their drive to move back in and to return back to their home. How do they do that? How do they rebuild? For them, it began with family, a mother and daughter together, working together, and then trying to convince their other family members and friends to move back as well. And then how do you do that in a way that is safe? Because so many people were not convinced early on to move back because of the threat of fire, which still persists. And they did so for themselves and tried to prove this to others, that by creating that defensible space, ripping down trees, so many trees went up in flames during that fire, by putting power lines underground, by building with those resistant materials, that it is possible to rebuild. It took them 2.5 years, and it took them a long time to even get the federal funding and the local and state funding to do so. But I think through their persistence and through, their faith that they would be able to rebuild, they were finally able to move back into their home 2.5 years later. They actually called that home Faith. And they are one of, I think, 8,000 people in a community of more than 30,000 people who now, 5 or 6 years later, are back in Paradise. So it's a long path forward. I don't think anyone has the exact recipe to how to rebuild, but they have shown that through persistence and through education and through really listening to the required changes to make a community more resilient, it is possible, and it is possible to build a community that can withstand a future disaster. Now you have a community in Paradise that is much more adapted to the wildfire country that it is in, much more so than before this fire hit in 2018.
Are there two buckets of people, in your opinion, those who emotionally and financially can afford to remain in a disaster-prone area and those who can't?
Yes. And money plays a big role. People who have money can put up the funding immediately without even having to worry necessarily at first glance about where the federal money will come later on and whether or not they will even get it. That allows them to build back quicker stronger, to reestablish their families in ways the less fortunate, those without money, can't. And so many times, and this is in wildfire country, it's called gentrification by wildfire. You see the haves moving in faster,
Hmm.
and the have-nots oftentimes moving on somewhere else. But more and more, it's becoming difficult for people without money, the less fortunate, to find affordable housing elsewhere. And many have no choice but to, in the case of Kylie and Ellie, they come from a humble background. They had no choice, and they had to fight through the red tape to get the funding to do so. But you certainly see an exodus of people who can't afford to even begin the process of picking up the pieces. But even those with money, I mean, money or not, there's the emotional toll that a storm takes on somebody, and that also plays a role in if people can rebuild. And oftentimes, hope and that sense of faith is its own currency,
Hmm.
and also dictates who moves back and who rebuilds.
Hmm. Why do you think climate change has become such a politically partisan wedge issue when we all drink the same water, we all breathe the same air, we're all impacted equally by weather disasters?
I think it's a great question with a complex answer. I think, simply put, it has become politicized because you have two sides taking a different stance on it, which has led to a fight when there shouldn't be, over science that is very clear. We listen to our doctor when our doctor tells us something, but for some reason we're not listening to our climate scientists.
Mm.
I think lobbying groups, I think big oil certainly has played a role in how people come to understand and ultimately are confused by what is causing climate change. And I think unfortunately that has taken a role. I remember 20 years ago, I'm dating myself, when I first started reporting as a journalist outside of college. When we covered climate change, we would have to give a voice to both sides. We would have to have those that believed in climate and climate deniers, even though the science was very clear that climate change existed and was the cause of so many of the disasters that we were seeing even back then. We had to give equal voice, even though those voices didn't stand up to the facts. So I think in that confusion, um, there's been this room for the politicization of climate change, which unfortunately should never have happened. I do feel like there is a rewinding of this to some degree. There's an organization, an observatory out of the University of Colorado Boulder, that actually monitors the media and its coverage of climate change. It's been doing so for decades, month by month. In January of 2000, it found only 26 stories on climate change aired
That's
across all the
incredible.
major networks. Yeah, then you had Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth come out in 2006. So the following January of 2007, this observatory found more than 260 stories on climate change aired across all the major networks, a 1,000% spike. Today, anywhere from 600 to 650 stories any given month airing across all of the major networks on climate change. And it's had an impact in people understanding the threat, because polling from 2000 showed only about 5% of people said they knew a lot about climate change. Today, more than 50% of people say they consider climate change a major threat. And in considering climate change a major threat, those are, I would think, people that aren't looking at the politics behind it. They're looking at the real world impacts of climate change. They're seeing it for the first time with their own eyes and clearly understanding the science. At least I hope.
Well, it's interesting because you are a member of the media, and to the point you made about lack of either awareness or discussion to the degree that's necessary, like, does someone like you need to go off and write a book, even though you're in the system? Do you need to go out of the system in order to shine a light on this problem?
I think there is an education in this crisis for everyone. And that has certainly been the case for the media. And I think the more that the media has reported on this, the more we've helped educate others. CBS has been incredible. And I don't just say this because they pay for my bills. I say this because they have sent me out time and time again whenever I raised my hand to go and cover these stories, whenever I insisted that we put climate change in as part of the story. They've always said yes. I think we need to do a better job as a media community here in the States and beyond, and continuing to make these links. I think a book certainly helps in carrying on that message, because my book is 300 pages. I don't get 300 pages worth of words for my 2-minute story on the nightly news, on the evening news with Nora O'Donnell. As much as I'm sure Nora would love to give me that amount of time, there are other stories in the world that we must cover. So I went out and I wrote this book. It was a cathartic process for me, but it was also an effort to bring back those important stories that I had seen, the people that I'd met, taking what was kind of left off on the cutting room floor and bringing it back to life in what I hoped was a meaningful way and a more in-depth way and a more intimate way for both myself, because there was so much I rediscovered, but also for my viewers, the people that watch the news, that see me covering these stories, that become readers. My hope is that they'll also be able to understand in a more nuanced way the threat.
How significant is the August 22nd Inflation Reduction Act in terms of its impact on battling climate change and protecting the environment?
I think whenever you have more money that is being pumped into efforts like battling climate change, is incredibly significant. The question also is, what do we do with all this money? We need to use it in smart ways. It needs to be clearly defined so that it's more effective. I'll use New York City one more time as an example. In 2021, they found that there was a 31% spike in sinkholes because of flooding and because of erosion. And city council officials in a meeting said, you can give us as much money as you want, but we're running out of engineering solutions to permanently fix this problem. So money is important, but I also think you need the minds to come up with new solutions, because you can pump money however much you want to into creating a new path forward. But if you're doing it based on old tools without taking into consideration new information, new technologies, ultimately what happens in Washington, what happens in our local and state governments, it will not matter if we're not thinking ahead, if we're not thinking in the future and coming up with new technologies and tools.
Well, Jonathan, this has been a fascinating conversation. There's so much to discuss on this issue. Hopefully you'll come back and we can continue the chat. And good luck with the book. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All righty. Take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Lengyel. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.